So first of all, congratulations on your 25th anniversary to the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide. And thank you for inviting me to give this lecture as part of your series. I'm honoured, and I want to celebrate the way in which you bring together the church, the academy, and the world. No mean ambition. And I'm really delighted that your new home, or relatively new home, is in what was once my kitchen, where I lived at the beginning of my time as principal here. So thank you. I have been involved, privileged to be involved with the ecumenical movement since my teenage years. I was part of a local ecumenical Christian youth group that included Anglicans, Methodists, Roman Catholics, and members of the URC. And I was fascinated then and grew to love in all sorts of ways Christians from other traditions. As I was nurtured in faith by a congregation of the URC and later prepared to be a minister, I was firmly rooted in the joys and the hopes of ecumenism. And a highlight of my early 20s was discovering and exploring the WCC text, Baptism, Eucharist and Ministry, with fellow theology students in Oxford. I remember how exciting that day was and how the sun was shining. Just over a decade later, in 1993, I was invited to go as a younger theologian to a Faith and Order World Conference in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. I was 32 then, with a toddler at home, who I was reluctant to leave for so long. But the conference set a direction for my life and my ministry. I was among hundreds of people staying in the large seminary buildings, listening to presentations and debates, open-mouthed, and gathering in the cathedral for worship. The meeting was dominated by the Greek word koinonia, communion, fellowship, as a different way of describing unity. I heard John Sizoulis give a speech, the Orthodox theologian who more than any other has transformed the way we think about the Trinity in the Western world. I met Rowan Williams for the first time. I learned songs from the World Church. I witnessed the Orthodox churches from countries that had only just come out from behind the Iron Curtain, struggling with what they saw as proselytism from the West. And I was impressed by the moderator, Mary Tanner, who I'm delighted to see on the screen, and never imagined that in 25 years I would be in her place, moderator of the commission, and beginning to think about another world gathering to mark 2025, the anniversary of Nicaea. But so much has changed in the world since I was a teenager, or even since that World Conference. And I have to recognize that the passion I feel for ecumenism, the fascination I still have for other Christian traditions than my own, and the thrill in connecting with them, the hopes for visible Christian unity in the way we imagined in 1972 in the URC, these things are no longer so widely shared. I want to take an opportunity in this lecture then to reflect on where, if possible, we might all find some inspiration to renew the ecumenical movement today. So just to give you a little insight into my own ecumenical life in the World Council of Churches, I'm now the moderator of the Commission on Faith and Order, a part of the URC that includes Roman Catholics as full members since Vatican II. And it's focused on calling the churches to unity in faith, in witness, in ministry, and in Eucharistic fellowship. And as a member of the Commission in various periods of its life, and mine, I've been to countless monasteries, conference centres, university faculties, and ecumenical institutes. I've debated long into the night, drafted and redrafted until I can bear it no more, been driven up into mountains or across snow-covered prairies and flown over too many seas, though not since COVID. I've been overwhelmed by hospitality. I've given lectures and sermons, even while sick with pneumonia, gained countless Facebook friends and brought home bags and bags of ecumenical gifts. I've written bylaws in hotel basements, given spontaneous speeches and talks in favelas, faculties, and factories, been dragged from my room late at night to sort out arguments, and met the most extraordinary and sometimes the most infuriating people. I've learned how you address a patriarch. I've walked across monastic fields by moonlight and learned never eat the salad. I've been hosted by the Dutch Reformed Church, grateful to be back in the ecumenical fold. I've been bribed with brandy by drafters, lain awake at night in threadbare former communist sheets, listening to the wolves, and conducted a theological seminar in a revolving restaurant while dropping with jet lag. I've been detained in Jerusalem, interrogated about my sermon in Kuala Lumpur, been locked out of a room in my own college, I think it was this very room, and I've preached at more length than I'm used to with very little notice to grateful crowds in Tanzania. I've planted trees, been interviewed on Radio Moscow with strict instructions, never mention the ordination of women, been rebuked for printing quotations from the church fathers on t-shirts that women would wear, made some friends for whom I would give my life, and also found myself criticized, ignored, and sometimes bullied. It's been quite a ride. So I work right now as moderator of the commission with the most wonderful people who are the Faith and Order staff. Good to see some of them on this call. And chiefly, I work with the director of Faith and Order, Odair Petroso Mateus, a theologian originally from Brazil. And the commission is about 45 people, Orthodox, Catholic, Reformed, Anglican, Quaker, Mennonite, Baptist, Methodist, Armenian, Pentecostal, with consultants and advisors too. It's a great privilege and a great challenge. But the challenge now is not only the work, not only the usual things like budget and politics and personalities, or even ecumenism and theology, but also the ways in which ecumenism itself is being placed under question or reframed. I'm convinced that we need a kind of reset or reboot. I'm committed to carrying into the future the very best of what we've done in the past, while also allowing and encouraging the movement to be renewed. I hope we can find again the source of what excited me as a teenager. And I say this because I think that in a world of division, hate speech, and culture wars, of identity politics and the worst of social media, we need a movement that treasures, values, and works above all for communion, for unity, and truly believes those things to be God's gifts to the world. So I've come from a church and from a generation that has celebrated what you might call the ecumenical virtues. Whether I'm in a local church or a global gathering, with every fiber of my being, I want to work at bringing people together and finding the common ground. I want to explore the things we have in common so that we can understand each other and indeed ourselves better. I long to resolve difficulties, however long held. I want us to deepen a sense of that we belong to one world and that we are one humanity. I'm truly fascinated by our differences, but appalled when difference leads to hatred and oppression, scapegoating, or violence. I believe in the common good, in human solidarity, that men and women are bone of bone and flesh of flesh, that we are right to name universal human rights, and that a good future for each of us must mean a good future for all of us. I believe in the Catholicity of the Church and that my identity and belonging can never be defined by my nation, gender, economic status, or ethnicity alone. And I treasure St. Paul's conviction written to the Galatians that in Christ there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And it's no coincidence that I belong to the United Reformed Church, a church that 50 years ago nearly, began its life by bringing together two close but different churches, and believed that this was but the first step on a journey that would have many other steps towards more church unions by now. I was born in the long aftermath of the Second World War and entered a world that longed to overcome violence and division, that wanted to open opportunities for everyone and to build a future in which nations would fight wars no more. So my later adult life has been lived then with something of a sense of disappointment, both about the fading of a post-war consensus and the fading of those hopes for Christian unity. I've seen how my own church has moved from what once felt like the frontline vanguard of church life to the margins. Someone trying to get in. And I recognize that the WCC is no more quite the carrier of the future hopes and aspirations of churches that it once was, and that there are other now much stronger movements within global Christianity. I have also begun to understand more deeply some of the ways in which that post-war consensus did not see the world clearly. And I've come to know some of the ways in which the culture I inherited needs to change and move in response to the cruel damage of the colonial past. I've come to see how what once looked like inexorable, enlightened progress was hiding a history that must first of all be resolutely faced. I know that the ecumenical movement needs to be transfigured, to be decolonized, and I recognize that people like me are sometimes part of the problem, and that some of my forebears have certainly been so. I can see that the ecumenical movement's beginnings, enmeshed as they inevitably were with colonial ambitions, must be faced squarely. But I am convinced that Christ's prayer for the unity of his followers is still his prayer for his disciples. And I fear for a world or a church that prefers to drive us to divide. And I want to discover how to be part of responding to Christ's prayer today. Now, I know that to speak of the ecumenical movement might be to speak of something wider than the World Council of Churches. But that's the piece of it that I know best, and it is the most formal part and in many ways a very inclusive part. So that's where I begin. The WCC is, as many of you know, a fellowship of 349 churches when I last looked, and about 500 million Christians. That's only a portion of the Christians in the world, though that's not quite the whole story, because there are 1.2 billion Roman Catholics in the world, and the Roman Catholic Church is not a member of the WCC, but full members. Roman Catholics are full members of part of the WCC's work. But there are huge parts of global Christianity that are not represented in the WCC and wouldn't want to be, and they are often now the fastest growing parts of Christianity. So the ecumenical movement needs transfiguring so that it can take account of those realities. And many will say that the movement also needs transfiguring because as it stands, it is too much a product of the global north. Certainly the WCC has been largely funded by Northern Europeans and North Americans. And our style of thinking and working originates in global north academic disciplines. And the people who've predominantly led it have been often from the global north, though not exclusively. I've sometimes heard people refer to NATO ecumenism. And the famous Edinburgh Conference of 1910 could be understood, partly at least, as a conference that was about the aspirations and concerns of northern colonial churches. These things, however shadowed now, continue to shape ecumenism. I'm often aware in ecumenical meetings that I have so much power simply because the meeting is conducted in my mother tongue. I often get to be the drafter or the moderator. And the style of work and writing expected is one with which, even if I'm sometimes weary, I'm familiar and I can operate it effectively. So many critique the WCC, and particularly the part of it that I'm most involved in, Faith and Order, as being too cerebral, disconnected from daily life. And in the most recent work of Faith and Order, we've spent decades producing a text on the church. But when we asked the churches to read it and to let us know what they thought of it, very few churches outside the global north have responded. This has concerned us so much that we've established workshops and consultations in Asia and in Africa to ask churches there what they would say about the church. And repeatedly, I've heard, even among some members of the Faith and Order Commission itself, appointed from global South churches, that the kind of theological work that we do is not at the heart of their concerns. For these and other reasons, perhaps that I've not discerned, but you might be able to see, the formal ecumenical movement that was once so exciting and which once attracted the best and most famous theologians and church leaders now seems rather old school. I have no illusions about that. You will have your own stories and reflections to add about the state of the ecumenical movement today. But I want to suggest that the unity for which Jesus Christ prayed and the unity that the WCC at its best continues to call the churches to is not at its heart about faded internationalism or colonialism or any kind of coercive uniformity. It is not a faded and outdated ambition belonging to former times, but really is something much more beguiling, attractive, and compelling. Now, I've noticed that some solutions to this flagging glamour of the WCC have either been overtly suggested or have begun to be assumed. So, for example, I hear voices that suggest that my own part of the ecumenical movement, Faith and Order, often portrayed as the most global north in style and the least obviously successful in terms of progress made or the ability to attract funding, frankly, should no longer be a priority. So some people say the direction of travel should be instead working together for peace and justice or working together for mission. I have heard senior, very senior church leaders in this country, the UK, say, for example, that ecumenism is fine as long as we stick to the goal of gathering our collective weight to speak out on important social issues, and that we should just be careful not to complicate any of that by talking about doctrine, which they say we will never agree about. So ecumenism becomes a kind of way of gathering power in numbers for making common cause, and often very good common cause, but that is all. And some, I think, might also prefer to leave ecumenism behind in favor of interfaith work, as though that is simply a more exciting extension of ecumenism. Some, I suspect, are content to let the future of ecumenical conversation be shaped by the equivalent of free market economics. Let's see who will survive in this time of decline and change, and talk to them. Some are simply focused on survival and feel that the unity of the church is no longer something in which to place precious time, resources, and energy. And even within the ecumenical movement itself, certainly among the church's responses to the recent Faith and Order successor text to them, the Church Towards a Common Vision, there are those who urge that we should simply accept that churches are different, recognize one another as churches nonetheless, and be reconciled to the diversity between and within the churches, even on the very most divisive issues. Just be reconciled that we are different and leave it there. But I'm reminded of the reflection of Jürgen Moltmann, as he described this reconciled diversity as the sleeping pill of the ecumenical movement. It makes the ecumenical movement dull, sleepy, and unengaging. And I think this is not the kind of thing for which Christ prayed with sweat and tears, that they may be one. Now, I understand more than many people why anyone might be wary of doctrinal debates. I know how painful they can be. I know how it can feel more imperative and easier simply to cheer one another on, to speak and act together for good in the world, to stand shoulder to shoulder together against racism, for equality, for a better world. And of course, that's vital. But it seems to me that there is a contradiction in us holding hands together as activists without putting our heads together as thinkers, prayers, and contemplatives. And even more, and this is where I want to suggest a new or renewed approach, we need to re-engage not only our heads and our hands, but our hearts. So here is where I want to suggest a kind of reboot. The theme of the upcoming WCC Assembly, to be held next year in Karlsruhe, is to be Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. This is the first time that the word love has been part of an assembly theme. Is it possible that the presence of this word and its implications could call the ecumenical movement into a new moment and wrest it from its impatience with thought or its turn to action together alone towards something that might inspire something more holistic, the best of head, hand, and heart together? Could the suggestion of an ecumenism of the heart give us a wake-up call? I sense that a renewed ecumenical moment needs to find again what it is that stirs us and moves us to join in Christ's prayer for unity. If the familiar doctrinal dialogues have become tired, then let's wake ourselves up. If our pilgrimages of justice and peace are sometimes so fragile that we find ourselves too afraid and reticent to speak our minds to one another for fear of rejection, then is there something that can help us again to discover why we thought being together was interesting, important, and worthwhile in the first place? If there are deep resentments that lie unnamed, historical injustices and abuses that must be faced from past history, then how can we do the work we need to do so that relationships can be renewed? I wonder whether perhaps like a long married couple, the ecumenical movement needs to clear the ground to make possible a revival of passion, of feeling, of love. Then perhaps we can let go of resentment and anxiety born of past wrong or present defensiveness, can revive ourselves when we are over familiar, can overcome our fears of failure before each other, and find again the passion and power of the Holy Spirit that calls to us. I only recently recognized that when any minister in the United Reformed Church, in my own church, is ordained, or even when inducted to a new pastorate, they are asked to make promises before the congregation, to declare faith in the triune God, of course, and to fulfill their duties as minister with faithfulness. But they are also asked to promise this, and I've made this promise myself. They're asked to promise to cherish love towards all other churches and to endeavour always to build up the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Now, this promise is not to respect other churches, to work with other churches, or even to seek agreement with other churches, but it is to cherish love. The value of love is even emphasized by that English word cherish, a word we know, of course, from the wedding service. And the nature of that promise is significant. And it contrasts so much with the mood and style of much present-day ecumenical encounter. I know that I am called not only to think about ecumenism, I'm not only called to engage in ecumenical action, but to cherish love, and in that place to find what some would call a heart for ecumenism. And I recognize that the place of love is not one in which I can or should protect myself from pain or disappointment, but one in which I can only make myself vulnerable to the other and risk what might be painful, but what might also be fertile and fruitful. So I think I've learned this through years of ecumenical work, but in the end, the quality of our work will always be shaped by the quality of the relationships. And I do not mean only that as we come to know each other, it's easier to find agreement, but that if we take seriously the imperative to love, and if we open ourselves to receive the gift of Christ's love working in us, then we shall be able to do more than we seem to be achieving right now. If we truly have love for one another, then the doctrinal debates are different, because we will long to know, well, why do you treasure the things that you do? And if we truly love one another, we will find that we want to understand each other's experience of inclusion or suffering or injustice. And we will find it natural to make each other's causes and campaigns our own. If we truly desire one another, as we might if we love one another, then we shall long to know what the other treasures and needs and why. So let me try to give you a bit of an example. I was once invited to co-moderate with a Russian Orthodox bishop a project on the teachers and witnesses of the early church. That's faith and order, ecumenical speak for the fathers. It was not an area that was a passion of mine, and I worked on the project with reluctance, and sometimes probably with bad grace. For me, the early teachers of the church felt at a great distance from me. They were mainly male, and I could only remember encountering them through the pages of books that I read so I could write essays. But as I took part in the project and met people and worshipped with people, I discovered the early teachers as part of a living tradition, as a tradition treasured by those sometimes denied access to them in times of persecution. I came to love those for whom they were close companions in the faith, those who I learned had treasured even small fragments of their words hidden in secret in the Soviet years. And in doing so, I came to love the early teachers. I had never learned about them as people of prayer, of passion, of warm humanity before, but in this encounter, that's what happened. And at the end of the project, at a WCC meeting in Crete, I spoke about how I had found myself introduced to a beloved extended family. I recognized that I had come deeply to desire a part of the Christian tradition that I had fearlessly critiqued. I wrote then, this is about love and community as much as it is about truth. And in a recent project of Faith and Order on moral discernment, bearing in mind that moral issues are the ones that most tend to divide Christians at the moment, what Faith and Order has done is publish a series of papers and a series of books, and this is the most recent, Facilitating Dialogue to Build Koinonia. A series of things which is not about resolving the differences, but about enabling Christians from different traditions to understand why Christians of other traditions think and feel as they do. It's about a way of listening attentively to those you're called to love, not so that you might change your mind, but so that you might come to be understood and understand. I think it's a project about love. Again and again, I have found in the ecumenical movement that it is the relationships that lead to movement. And this is why ecumenism cannot really happen by conference call or webinar alone. It happens in the friendships built over time. It happens as people come to love one another. It comes in the passion for each other that spills over into the longing for unity. It is love that moves us, the love of Christ moving within us, and with it the very human love of friendship and the companionship of pilgrims. I remember one instance when I had profoundly disagreed, aggressively disagreed with someone in a debate, and then we were going to communion together. And I said to him, I cannot go and take communion unless we find peace with one another. And we did make peace, and we took communion together. And that person is now a beloved friend. Love is what can stir us to keep going when the work of dialogue is intractable and hard, when ideas clash, and when even the style of discourse is contested. When we are moved, it is love that does it. Even when we think we are being scholarly and thoughtful preeminently, even when we are engaging in apparently academic dialogue, it is love that will make the difference. In the most recent Faith and Order text on the church, there is a glorious sentence which says, "The first and foremost attitude of God towards the world is love, for every child, woman, and man who has ever become part of human history, and indeed for the whole of creation." Well, what would it mean if our foremost attitude towards each other were indeed love? There is such a significant moment in the Gospel of John when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples and makes the self-giving love of his heart visible. And at this moment, he says to the disciples, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." It is ultimately the quality of the relationships between us that will make visible the divine communion we profess. So what difference could it make to the way we live and shape the ecumenical movement if we started with love? What would it mean to be part of an ecumenical movement that was moved first by the heart, by compassion, not defensiveness, lived in imitation of God's foremost attitude towards the world? I think this may be something of the attitude and approach of what has come to be called receptive ecumenism, a way that looks for the beauty of another's tradition, but is attentive and hospitable to the other, that even desires to receive the other into oneself. The word communion, now sometimes chosen above the word unity, implies the kind of unity that happens when people love one another. In our most intimate lives, we may experience, if we are truly blessed, and if it is our vocation, the wonder of the love that brings human beings together in such a way that they are made one, not just physically, but we might say spiritually. And there are many relationships in our lives in which we know how close unity and love can be. Love draws us to one another, makes us want to be together, to share everything we have, to make a new community, to bring forth life, and to stand beside one another, even when trouble comes. Love and communion go hand in hand. I remember that when I was a young minister, a wiser, older minister told me that pastoral ministry was governed by a simple imperative: you've got to love them. I understood, because of the man he was, that he did not mean something sentimental by this, but that he was naming the kind of kenotic love that Christ showed as he washed the feet of his disciples and then gave us a new commandment. Love, the love that we know as we are in Christ, is not a light and fragile thing, but a strong, challenging, and brave thing. If the ecumenical movement could truly be reborn from that kind of love, then I think it could flourish. The call to unity, to communion, to love across difference and borders and boundaries is neither an expression of post-war optimism or naive romanticism. It is the call to follow Christ, who commanded us to love one another. This is the kind of love that never coerces or oppresses, that does not flinch from painful revelations or honest encounter, and that is looking forward and is prepared to walk together. So just to almost end with a story, let me tell you about what happened to me and some of my ecumenical companions on a January day in 2020, just before COVID. We were at a WCC meeting at Chateau Bossé in the countryside near Geneva, a beautiful place once gifted to the WCC. The people there with me were from many different churches and from places all over the world. When Sunday came, it happened that no one had arranged for us to go anywhere together for worship, and so we were on our own. Some people got a taxi or somehow had a lift in Geneva to go to the church community of their tradition, but about 10 or so of us were left behind. The main chapel in the chateau was being used by a paying group, so we went up the winding stairs to the tiny chapel at the top. We were a group of Catholics and Protestants, and one Catholic priest among us, one of the kindest, gentlest people I know, was somehow naturally determined to lead the service. He and I have drafted documents together, negotiated airport security, sung songs around campfires, with him playing the guitar and much more. He went to a long cupboard and found a gown that fitted him nearly. He brought some bread from the kitchen and he hunted in the bottom of the cupboard until he found the wine. He found the mass book with the prayers. He couldn't find the lectionary readings for the day, so someone else found them on her phone. She read one, I read one, and then she passed her phone to him so he could read the gospel. The readings were about the baptism of Christ, and we shared our own baptisms and said something about what they meant to us. We shared informal thoughts and some silence, and thought about baptism, the gift we all had in common. Though some of us baptized as babies, and some on confession of faith as believers, but all baptized. We prayed and hoped that we might grow deeper into fulfilling the promises we made, or that were made at the time, and we thanked God for bearing with us and welcoming us into the family of the church. We prayed for the world, and even with so few of us, quite a bit of the world, with all its flawed and painful history of empire, slavery, and suffering, was represented there in the room. From Australia to Jamaica, from the UK to the US, from Brazil to Belgium. And when it came to the Mass, it was left to our own conscience what to do. It was an extraordinary and lovely service. We brought to it the churches we'd left at home. We brought our own traditions. We brought the concerns of our countries and the realities of our lives. We brought the memories of our baptisms, and we felt so deeply what unites us, the love of Christ poured out in one baptism. Nothing we'd argued about in the meeting or fought over in the discussions could keep us apart. We were all vulnerable, moved, and at peace with one another. This encounter, the quality of it, the love we shared, I see too in some of the intercultural encounters that you encourage at CCCW. I think of Danny from Westcott House going to the Rosebud Native American Reservation in the US and saying, I do not doubt for one moment that this has been the single most formational experience of my entire life. Or I think of, was it Maggie who went to Cambodia, not being able to communicate easily, but learning how to show love and receiving love. In the ecumenical work I've done and in the wider work of the WCC, we work tirelessly to agree texts and to find agreement, doing the slow, patient work over decades that in sometimes small and sometimes amazing ways does bring change. It's work that can be strained and painful, and the words come best when we have got to know one another so well that the will and the desire to cherish love is deep. And I've been glad to be part of the WCC's pilgrimage of justice and peace, and privileged to visit communities around the world in places where the ecumenical movement does not usually gather. Relationships made in those settings have done more to shift my attitudes and my hopes for the world than countless papers. That kind of encounter needs to be made possible for more people in the ecumenical movement so that friendships and love can flourish. I've had more than my share, and I thank God for them. And I would love to make those encounters more possible for the many people who now think that the ecumenical movement is about tired and abstract debates. Plunge into it for a moment, and you will find that it is about your heart. Debates and causes and dialogues come to life when love is made possible and when everyone involved is committed to love one another. Even the most complex subjects can be faced and shared and overcome by those determined to hear that command to love, who are fascinated by the other and who desire to be with the other. An ecumenical journey which is more like a pilgrimage engaging body, mind, heart, is more likely to be one in which all of us can find ourselves on common, level, and fruitful ground. An ecumenism newly inspired by love, moved and shaped by body, mind, and heart, may find that it beats more strongly for new times and among new communities. And I pray that that will indeed be so.